If you have a Bible and you like to follow along, please take it and turn in it to Hebrews chapter 8. This is where we will spend our time. Hebrews chapter 8. Jesus said a lot of things that I really like, which is good. Some of the things he said are kind of scary, but a lot of things he said are really nice to hear. And one of them is one that I find to be my favorite. He says, "Come to me," he says it to all of us, "Come to me, all of you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon me, for I'm meek and lowly. My yoke is easy, my burden is light, and you will find rest for your souls." And as a follower of Jesus now for almost 40 years, that is certainly my experience, to find rest for my soul, because the big question that looms for every human being is, when I die, what happens? And Jesus answers that question for us. So there's a huge sense of rest in that. But in so many ways, and I don't say this to be disrespectful at all, I say it because it's the way it is. We've just, as we looked at this list of prayer concerns this morning, people who are very sick, people who have died, people who have family members that are at the point of death, and so much going on in the world, warfare and starvation and things that we see around us. What does it really mean when Jesus says, "Take my yoke upon you. My yoke is easy, my burden is light"? And the fact that that question is raised up in us, why is it that we have that question? I think it's worth thinking about. So what I'd like to do is turn to Hebrews chapter 8, and I will begin reading in verse 1. Now, the main point of what we are saying is this: we have such a high priest, one who sat down at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven, a minister in the sanctuary, in the true tabernacle that the Lord, not human beings, set up. For every high priest is appointed to offer both gifts and sacrifices, so this one too had to have something to offer. If he were on the earth, he would not be a priest, since there are already priests who offer the gifts prescribed by the law. The place where they serve is a sketch in the shadow of the heavenly sanctuary, just as Moses was warned by God as Moses was about to make complete the tabernacle. God said, "See that you make everything according to the design shown you on the mountain." But now Jesus has obtained a superior ministry, since the covenant that he mediates is better and enacted on better promises. For the first covenant, if it had been faultless, no one would have looked for a second covenant. But showing its fault, God says to them, "Look, the days are coming, says the Lord, when I will complete a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. It will not be like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt. Because they did not continue in my covenant, I had no regard for them, says the Lord. For this is the covenant I will establish with the house of Israel. After those days, says the Lord, I will put my law in their minds, and I will inscribe my law in their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. And there will be no need for each one to teach anyone else, to teach their brother or sister, saying, know the Lord, since they will all know me, from the least to the greatest. For I'll be merciful toward their evil deeds, and their sins I will remember no longer. When God speaks of a new covenant, he makes the first covenant obsolete. Now what is growing obsolete and aging is about to disappear. This is a very extensively theological text, and it teaches a lot. And I don't want to go into all of it, because if I did, that would be all we would talk about. But in this, you've got to see, I think, it's clear that this person, whoever wrote the letter to the Hebrews, and we don't know, but whoever it is, they are clearly a very good Jewish scholar. They understood Judaism very, very well. And he goes into the detail here to describe the aspects, the physical aspects of the priesthood. He points to the temple and the tabernacle, the physical places where these things were to all take place, in the Holy of Holies, where the priests would go in and come out once a year. He points to the precision, and this is what this text, in my view, one of the main focuses here is the precision of the tabernacle. I don't know if you've ever taken the time to read Exodus 25 to 31, but gosh, I would hate to have been Moses. I mean, to have to get all that stuff right. The detail involved in setting up the tabernacle, and then subsequent to the tabernacle, of course, in Solomon's time, the detail in setting up the temple. The precision involved was just mind-boggling. I mean, I know something about building things, and I would not want to have to follow that set of instructions knowing the consequences if I failed. It's an incredible thing. But then verse 7 starts to take us down the road of a promise of better things. And this is confusing, I think, until we think about it a little more deeply. Did God make a mistake? Right? The first covenant had flaws in it. That's what the text says. Now, what does that mean? Well, it's not pointing to God's failure. It's pointing to ours. That is, the flaw in the covenant was the fact that we couldn't keep it. That was the whole flaw. And God then had to have a second covenant, which was a remedy for the first one. In other words, this is not a mistake. This is a plan. One of the aspects of what we see going on in our government today, anybody who thinks that this is all just a bunch of bungling doesn't understand what's going on. It's a plan. There's a plan in mind here. This is not an accident. Well, think of it from the perspective of a supreme being who's omniscient, who knows all things. There's no mistake in the original covenant. The flaw was in us, that we just were not able to keep it. The law was perfect. The problem was we aren't. And so we failed to keep the first covenant. And so the big plan was that God had another covenant in mind all along. Once we fell in the garden, however you want to read that, God's plan was then set in motion right away. A plan that was going to remedy what happened in the garden for all time. The limitation of the law, the first covenant, was it was a physical practice. That was the limitation. I would encourage anybody who wants to understand with some clarity how it is Judaism connects with Christianity, just take the Bible and take Hebrews chapters 7 through 10 and just read them and try to understand what's going on. If you have to bring in other commentaries, that's fine. But those 4 chapters will explain in great detail exactly how Judaism connects with the new covenant in Christianity now. Very well. The high priest, the priesthood would run in and out. They could run in and out with buckets of blood forever. And it was not going to do what God had intended to be done once we fell. Yes, there was cleansing for the people. The priests go in once a year on Yom Kippur. Yom, day, Kippur, atonement. Go in on once a year on Yom Kippur and make atonement for the people for that year. But the problem, the flaw, if you want to call it that, was with all of the physical requirements, people's hearts were not being changed. There was no change of heart. The sin was taken care of for that year, but the person for whom the sin was being sacrificed for was not being changed in their person. They were not changed. They just, okay, we did our bit in front of the priest today. They kept a herd of sheep. 250,000 is the estimate that I've seen, so that they would have sufficiency of brand new lambs to make 2 sacrifices a day every day. Just imagine. So all of this is going on, and you've got centuries of history here. What's happening? God, in the big plan, has decreed such that he knows that we needed that history so that we as human beings would learn what we had to learn, so that then when the new covenant comes, there would be a background by which we could even understand it. Can you imagine if you, and this is hard to imagine, I can't, but if you chop Judaism out of this and you've just got Jesus, a Palestinian teacher, sacrificed on a cross, even raised from the dead, it still doesn't really make sense without the Judaism that's behind it. It would be hard for us to grasp what was going on here. The problem, of course, was when the first covenant came to be, it was perfect as it was given toward the plan, but the problem was that just like with us today, it got nitpicked until it was so big that nobody could live it. Nobody could live it originally. Just get that straight right away. But by the time of Jesus, the law had become so huge, nobody could live it. Why was it nitpicked? For the same reason we always nitpick laws. We're hunting loopholes in it. We want some way to actually live it. Now, the Pharisees were the most devoted people insofar as living the law in the Jewish culture in Jesus' time. They could live off temple tax. They didn't have to have jobs. They could spend their whole day doing nothing but trying to obey the law, and they did try. But the person out there who's working a normal job, raising children, supporting a family, no way could they live the law. And so what came to be? Nitpicking. So somebody says, well, you can't work on the Sabbath. Well, okay, we've got to eat, we've got to get dressed, we've got to take care of children, we've got to do things. I mean, there's some things we just have to do. How do we do that? How do we take the Sabbath and not do any work? Well, they figured out a way to do that. They said, okay, we need to figure out what work is. What is work? You can't pick up anything heavier than a dried fig. That's work. So they nitpicked, and this is the way the law was done. There were some Jews who were wealthy who would hire Gentiles to come in. This is still done today in some Orthodox circles, where they will hire Gentiles to come in and work for them to do the work that they can't do on the Sabbath day. They can be strict observers, but they bring somebody in. It's kind of like the Jains in Hinduism. I don't know if you know anything about the Jains, but they are definitely strict Hindus. As a matter of fact, if you know anything about Hinduism, you know that there's the law of transmigration. You know what that is? That means that when you die, if you've had a bad life, you might come back as a lower form of life, like a cabbage or a worm. And then you have to go up through the ladder of reincarnation until you finally come back to being human, until you finally attain moksha, which is release from the wheel. Well, the poor Jains, I mean, they're just in terrible trouble because they say all life is sacred. I can't eat the blackberries out there. That might be Uncle Louie in his transmigratory journey. What are they going to eat? They find a loophole. What's the loophole? They go to their begging bowl and they come to your house, Marshall. You're not a Jain, so you can cook the blackberries or whatever it is you're eating and kill them, and that they can eat them without any guilt because they're not the ones that killed them. A loophole. That's how it works. And so the Jews did the same thing. The law was unlivable. And so they had to come up with loopholes in order that they could live their life under this law and still think of themselves as good Jewish followers. All of the law was geared pretty much toward bodily practice, with the exception of the Decalogue. Right? You'll love the Lord your God with your heart, mind, soul, and strength. You'll have no idols. But most of the law was geared toward bodily practice. Go back and read the precepts of Moses in Deuteronomy, and you see just how much of that has to do with farming and agriculture and animals and slaves and life and wives and children and everything else. Very strict. But in order to live it, you've got to figure out some way around some of it, or you just can't live. Think about it from us. I mean, we in this country, my wife and I pay, I forget what the bill was this time, it was almost $500 to get our taxes filled out. Why do we do that? You ought to be able to just say, I made this much, and get a calculator out and say, I owe this much, and send a check in. You ought to be able to do that, but no, we've got to hire somebody, and then they have to buy a software every year in order to just make sure that we don't go to the big house for not paying our taxes properly. The tax code right now, as I stand here today, 19,000 pages. Who could know that? What person can? So what do? We find loopholes. That's how we do it, right? That's why we pay that $500. Find me every loophole that I can avoid paying tax on wherever I can legally. And it requires somebody of that mindset that's devoted to that one thing just for us to find the loopholes, legal loopholes. There are a lot of Christians today, people in churches, who want to bring back the ordinances in some degree or another. You don't think that's true? Certain kinds of dress. I'll never forget walking into a church I'll not name. Where's your coat? Don't you know a man showing up for church should have a coat? I didn't know that was a rule. Certain kinds of music, certain kinds of dress, certain kinds of decoration, certain kind of everything. And a lot of believers are very much on board with that kind of thinking. They want to bring some of it back. And you know, I have some sympathy for that. I do. Because a list is a lot easier than having to figure it out for yourself. I was at a church once. I know I've told this story probably who knows how many times now, but they asked me to come when I was doing what's called supply. You come in and you sub for somebody who's out. And I walked in there and I looked up on the board, and there on the wall, painted in calligraphy, was the list of things that you could and could not do in order to be a member of the church. It took 2 walls worth to cover all the details of what you could and could not do. Then Paul says this: do not let anyone, Colossians chapter 2, judge you with respect to food or drink or in a matter of a feast, a new moon, or a Sabbath day. These are only a shadow of the things to come. The reality is Christ. So what's going on? What happened to the easy yoke and the light burden? I'll tell you what happened. Human beings and a good turn of heart. That's what happened. It's a good turn of heart to want to make rules. Because what are we trying to do? We're trying to contain people's behavior. Right? And nothing really wrong with that. A lot of people in the New Testament church want a list because that list will bring some clarity about what it is we're supposed to do and not do. It just makes it easier for us. I have some friends who recently, in a restaurant I'll not name, how about that? They had a teachers' conference. And they went to the conference and they were served a meal. Well, a lot of the teachers like wine with their meal. And so came time for the meal, the conference is going on, they bring the wine glasses out and set them down and start pouring wine, and the teachers, got really nervous, some of them, and said, no, could you bring it to us in a styrofoam cup? Why did they want it in a styrofoam cup? Because they didn't want anybody to know what they were drinking with their meal. That's why. They felt shame. Hide the alcohol, the preacher's coming to the house. That kind of business. Why are we ashamed? Because we're proud. I'm a better Christian than you. You'll never see me drinking. Right? That's how we look at so much of it. Where does that come from? It comes from pride. That's not an easy yoke or a light burden. It becomes a heavy yoke and a heavy burden. And we're the ones that make it. We're the ones loading the backpack so many times. Paul goes on to say, in the same chapter in Colossians, these things have no value at all. The avoidance of this and the avoidance of that, touch not, taste not, he says, they have no value. Now, I would look at that and say, gosh, that's a head scratcher. I mean, it seems like some things might be good for us not to dabble in, right? Yeah, sure. But we're not speaking of physical things here. That's the distinction. It's a good turn of heart that wants to heap burdens on Christians. A lot of times it's Christians that are heaping the burdens, and it's a good turn of heart that they do. But C.S. Lewis says it so well. He says the worst tyranny that is done is the tyranny that's done by other humans for our own good. That's the worst. And I think he's right. See, what the list does and what the burdens do and what reinstating the Jewish law does is it makes us look at each other instead of looking at God. I'm the one that's important because of my obedience. Look at me. And we all start to feel that. Isn't it interesting that Jesus speaks of God's provision in the form of the lily? Now think about a poor lily. I love this little poem. I don't know who wrote this. I'll read it for you. It's interesting. It speaks to this. I feel as weak as a violet, alone with the awful sky. Winds wander, the dewdrops earthward, the rains fall, the suns rise and set, the earth whirls, all but to prosper, a poor little violet. What are the characteristics? Jesus says this. He says, look at the lilies. They're not doing anything. And look how God takes care of them. Look how He clothes them. What are the characteristics of a flower? Well, they're fragile for one thing. I mean, you step on a flower, it's done. They're immobile. The flower can't go anywhere to get what it needs. And if the flower finds what it needs, it grows all by itself. It's hard, you see, as a Christian to think that God will provide in that way when we're maybe doing nothing that we think would make God impressed with us. It's hard. It's hard not to want to please Him, and it's hard not to stretch that into making rules for ourselves and rules for other people that don't have anything to do with growing toward God at all. Paul says we are drawn to the appearance of wisdom because we like to appear wise. But as soon as we give in to that physical performance in some way, we're going to find ourselves failing. Because now we're saying, I'm the example. I'm the one that everyone should look to. And we like that feeling. The default position is hard for us to avoid. But what God wants for us is to lean in full dependence upon Him, such that the yoke is easy and the burden is light. I remember something about this. I went to work in Annapolis, Maryland on a bridge project. I had never worked in anything like that. I'd always worked on houses, and the highest house I ever got on was a 2-story. Maybe I'm 20, 25 feet off the ground, no big deal. Of course, if you fall, it's a big deal, but it wasn't a big deal to stand there. Now I'm on a bridge where I'm going to be 225 feet off the concrete, and everything's a lot different when you're 200 feet off the ground, trust me. And so I wanted to impress these foremen, right? I want them to think, wow, they really need Rip. I mean, he's a worker. So foreman said, I want you to climb up there on top of the form, and I want you to start taking those bolts and washers off. I said, okay. So I climbed up there and took my tools up there, and I climbed up, started doing it, and I was holding on with one hand and cranking away on the bolts. And this superintendent walked up who was standing, I was in a hole that was 40 feet deep and had climbed up to the top of the form. The water, though, is right there. This is inside of a big, what's called a cofferdam, where the water's pumped out and you can work in the dry 40 feet under the river, surface of the river. And so the foreman walks out to the edge of the barge and says, Snow, what are you doing out there? I said, I'm debolting this form. You know, I just kept working. I work harder now. The foreman's looking at you. You know, you want to really go now. Just have a dust cloud around you. He says, you get down off that form. Where's your safety belt? I said, oh, and this is classic me. This is classic Rip. I don't need a safety belt. I'm fine. You know, just keep cranking away. I'm 40 feet off the concrete. You know, if I slip, I'm gone. You get down off the form and you go to the office and they'll issue a safety belt, and then you come back and finish what you're doing. So I did. Came back. I put the safety belt on, strapped it in, hooked it off. For 2 weeks, all these muscles in here were so sore, I couldn't take a deep breath. You know why? Because I wasn't trusting the safety belt. I was leaning forward the whole time because I just could not allow myself to just lean back in that thing. There was something so unnatural. Even though it's enough strength to hold 1,000 pounds, I was afraid of it because that's hard to just lean back like that. But you see, I was making a yoke for myself that was hard, a heavy burden, unnecessarily. I didn't need to do that. It's the same with God. It's the same with God. We don't I don't lean back into God in the way that I ought. I'm always hanging on to everything. I'm always trying in ways that God never intended me to try or you to try. Think about prayers. There's nothing about praying that we have to get right. Nothing. The words don't have to be right. The content doesn't have to be right. And we can rest in it because, after all, think of yourself. Put yourself in this position. Somebody calls you, they think of you in a certain way, and they say, would you come to the hospital and pray for so-and-so to be healed? Right? It's a little intimidating. It is. But why? If somebody says, Rip, pray for me to be healed, and I've had people ask me to do that, I feel that tension, but then I realize, wait a minute, I'm not doing anything. All I'm doing is asking, and God's going to do it or not. It's up to the Lord. It's His discretion. It's not me. I don't have to get it right. All I've got to do is come and ask. And then God will answer in the way that He sees fit. You know, if it's me doing it, who's being glorified then? Right? So if we're doing things on our own, God's not the one being glorified. But if it's God that's being glorified, then the yoke is very easy. The burden is very light. It's not up to me. It's up to Him. All I've got to do is lean back and leave it to Him. I don't know where everybody is today, but if I've said anything about